appreciate it. So Scrum started at West Point. Yeah, my father was a cadet in the early 1960s at West Point. And when he got there in his senior year, he got made training officer of company L2, which is known as the loose deuce. The training officer basically just teaches everybody how to march, and like they rate each of the companies how well they march in these parades they do 3 times a week. And L2 was known as the loose deuce because it had been the worst marching company since the Civil War. 100 years of mediocrity. And think about that, they're replaced 100% every 4 years. And so, the new commander, and my father is the training officer, so of course they do the standard thing, and they say, well, we're going to march all the time. At night, on weekends, in rain, we're going to make them march, and nothing. Didn't make them any better. And so my father had this idea. He says, well, so how they judge the marching of all the training officers of all the companies, we get together and they go, on a scale like, Charlie stuck his sword in the dirt, so that's a demerit, or they didn't turn tight enough, or whatever it was. And so he just wrote those on index cards and put them up in the barracks where people had to walk by them every day, multiple times a day. And apparently that bulletin board ended up in the bushes more than once. But by making it visible what was going on, they went from the worst company to the best company in 3 months. And right around then was when General MacArthur died. And the best company of cadets buried him down in Richmond. They marched behind his casket. And I've talked to pretty much everyone who's in that company that's still around, and they said they've never forgotten that lesson their entire lives. And then after West Point, he went into the Air Force, and he became a fighter pilot. He flew F-4s, RF-4s, reconnaissance over North Vietnam. 2 tours there, 100 missions over North Vietnam. And back then, the casualty rate for fighter pilots was 50%. 50% of them didn't come back. This is one of his classmates from West Point, Ed Atterbury, who was shot down, and he was a really tough guy, man. He got captured by the North Vietnamese, escaped, then got captured again, and didn't get out the second time. But I was talking to this Marine the other day, and he said, I get it now. In combat, our customer is the enemy because they give us really, really fast feedback of whether we're doing the right thing or not. And so my father said, so he gets there and he replaces this wing that had like 2 planes that could still fly, and he gets there and he says, well, what are we going to do differently? And what they had been doing is following a flight plan. Okay, go here, turn here, go there. Okay, now you're over Hanoi. Drop your bombs, get out, right? And he said, we're not going to do that. And think about it, they're reconnaissance. So they're going in before the strike and then after the strike when everyone is awake. And so what he said is, what we're going to do is we're not going to follow a plan. We're going to do constant evasive maneuvers the entire time we're in North Vietnamese airspace. And then he would, pull out as fast as he can. He didn't lose a single guy in that deployment. Because he said, if you follow a plan, everyone knows what you're going to do. And if it's the enemy out there, they're going to do it. So he took that, and those are 2 of the really important parts of Scrum. Making work visible and responding to change over following a plan. And that came right from his experience in the military. The other thing that really influenced him, they brought into Scrum, is John Boyd's OODA loop. John Boyd was known as the Mad Major. He's probably the best fighter pilot in the history of the Air Force. And he had this thing called the OODA loop, which is, great name, huh? You observe what's going on. What space are you in? And then you orient yourself in that space. Basically, okay, what's the environment I'm in? Where am I at in that environment? And then you decide what to do. You have a hypothesis. Okay, if I do this, this is what I think is going to happen. And then you act. And John Boyd said, if your OODA loop is faster than your enemies, they start responding to what you do rather than you responding to them. And each one of those moments, you get rapid feedback. You have a hypothesis, you validate your hypothesis. And this is true whether you're fighting wars or whether you're making software or agricultural equipment or rockets. Those are the kind of companies I work with. So now I want to talk about the Agile Manifesto. So the Scrum, my father then became a medical school professor for a bunch of years, then he went into the software business. And so Scrum was formalized in like 94, was the first sprint. January of 1994 was the first Scrum sprint. A few years later, in 2001, a bunch of people got together. There's some people from Scrum, people from other, have become known as Agile Methods, DSDM, Crystal, Kanban. I mean, I won't bore you with all of them. And they got together at this place in Snowbird, Utah, a ski resort. And there were 17 of them. And they were all trying to wrestle with, the way software was developed at that time. Like really heavy, like writing these big requirements documents, sort of standard stuff. And what was happening was there were more and more total and complete failures because the software was getting more and more complicated. And so they got together and they argued there was 2 days, and they argued the first day over what to call it, what they were doing, whether they collectively call it, because they wanted a good marketing term. At the end of the first day, it came down to either lightweight or agile, and they thought they could sell agile better. So that's what they called it. The second day, they started arguing again. And like, what does that mean? Okay, now we have the term. What does that term actually mean? And at the mid-morning break, 10:30, about 9 of them went outside for a smoke. It's 2001. People smoke then. And there are 8 people. This guy named Martin Fowler got at the board. It would be really a shame if we were here for this many days and we didn't come up with anything. And in about 15 minutes, he wrote these 4 values, which I'll show you in a second, on the board, this whiteboard. And then the guys came back in from the smoke break, and this guy named Ward Cunningham, who was probably the most technical person there, he invented the wiki, stuff like in fitness, very famous technically. And he just goes, that's awesome, not a word changed. And then they put it on a website, agilemanifesto.org, and they had no idea what had just happened. So I see this kind of stuff a lot in the military. Like this 2010 Defense Acquisitions Act, basically they want an agile process. Right? They have to develop an agile acquisition process for software. I have no idea. I've tried to figure out who put this there, and I have no idea who did it at all. But basically they said, okay, we want a process that early and continual involvement of the user, multiple rapidly executed increments, early successful prototyping, and a modular open systems approach. That's basically Scrum, or Agile. And I'm going to use those terms because they are different. Agile is a set of values. Scrum is a way of making those values real, of operationalizing it. And there are other ways besides Scrum, which I will not tell you because I work for Scrum Inc. But, no, if you're interested, I'm happy to talk about it. But depending on whose survey you believe, it's between 2/3 and 3/4 of all Agile teams use Scrum, depending on, this is the surveys. And so, and this is why all those companies are doing it, and this is what I think the Defense Department is starting to wrestle with. Because the reason everyone is changing to Scrum, this is from the Standards Group data. This is data on scores, like 50 or 60,000 projects around the world that the Standards Group goes around and indexes and failure, success. And traditional project management, about 1/4 of them are total successes, on time, on budget, happy customers. About 1/5 of them total failure, nothing of value created, just waste. And about 1/2 of them are late, over budget, right? It's not bad. In Agile projects, about 40% of them are on time, on budget, happy customers, and only 8% of them are total and complete failures. But there's still about 1/2 of them which are late, over budget, unhappy customers. They deliver some value. So I want to try to get you to think about how can we start here rather than do some bullshit. And the Defense Innovation Board, I know there's some members of that, came up with this really good thing I found a few months ago. Before I was invited to this, I just found this on the internet somewhere. And they say, how do you tell Agile BS? And it's things like, our team's delivering working software to real users every iteration, including the first. All right. Is there a project charter? Do all members of the team understand how they contribute to that? Is feedback from users turned into concrete work on a timeline short of the month? This is the really important one in my mind. This is what I run into now all the time. It's the full ecosystem of the project Agile. This is to have a bunch of Agile software development, but you can't get out the door because of bureaucratic process for deployment. This is why DevOps is important. Are teams empowered to change the requirements based on feedback? This is very hard in defense projects, I've found. And are teams empowered to change their process? So that's pretty good stuff, right? But so here are the Agile values. Individuals and interactions over processes and tools. And it's like, not that there don't need to be processes and tools, but they value individuals and interactions more. Working product over comprehensive documentation. The only measure of success in delivering Agile is working stuff. I always ask people when they say they're Agile, I was like, do your teams release working software every 2 weeks or a week or two, every sprint? Most people, anybody here have their teams deliver working stuff every sprint? Nice, a couple of them. Usually about 5%, even in Silicon Valley. But that's definitional. That's what Agile is. And if you're not there, you got to think about what do we need to do to get there? What's the smallest step we could take tomorrow to try to get there? Customer collaboration over contract negotiation, and responding to change over following a plan. That's all Agile is. A set of values. Like there's some principles and stuff behind these values, but because they had to do something the rest of the day. But that's what Agile is. So when someone says they're Agile, it's really important to ask, what does that mean to you? Because in the context of projects and product development and all that kind of stuff, it has a very particular meaning. It's a term of art. So, and this is what happens a lot, and I see this. I live here in DC, by the way. I live about a mile away from here. I live on Capitol Hill. And when I talk to people a lot, they're like, everyone argues over what Agile is. They use the same words and mean different things. So I would like you to know what Agile actually means in the context of product and projects. Now, I was talking to the CEO of the Standards Group a few months ago, and I said, Jim, we know that Scrum and Agile have higher success rates. Do we know why it works? We just have a correlation, not a causation. So he said, yeah, Jade, I've been thinking about this. So he just published his latest chaos report, which I highly recommend, that it turns out it's how long does it take to make decisions. And if you can make a decision, once you know you have to make a decision, how fast can you make a decision? If you can do that in less than an hour, about 60% of the projects are successful. If it takes you more than 5 hours, which is not that long, only 18% are totally successful. And so this is what Scrum and Agile do, is they push the decision-making down to the teams where they can make rapid decisions. This requires a few things. Guardrails, right? I make sure that they don't totally sub-optimize for local stuff or don't do things that are illegal or whatever. And having a vision and a mission that they understand and can articulate. But also you got to empower them to make these things. So if you have to wait for the committee to meet in 2 weeks to make a decision, it's going to be really hard to do stuff. Because Jim was telling me, he says his rule of thumb is basically about every $1,000 you spend on a project, you need to make a decision. You have a $10 million project, that's 10,000 decisions. And if each of those takes a day, and some of them are really trivial, right? They're trivial decisions. Because projects normally don't die dramatically. They die a day at a time. The death of 1,000 cuts. That's what happens. So, if you haven't read McChrystal's book, Team of Teams, I like it quite a bit. So he talked about going from sort of traditional military command and control to command of teams, where there would be specialist teams, and then to what he did in Iraq, having teams of teams, cross-functional teams that could do things. And it was pretty dramatic. I was there at the time. So this is DIA reported attacks on multinational forces in Iraq over a few years. And this is the y-axis is in the thousands. And it got really bad. I was there. In fact, it was a pretty loud place. I was not in the green zone. Journalists don't stay in the green zone. Some of them did. I was in the red zone. And then McChrystal shows up in August of 2007. McChrystal and Petraeus. And it was like a light switch. It was amazing, the number of attacks that went down. It was really incredible. And I didn't really know how they were doing it because it was all secret at the time. But basically, it's getting things out of people's way to unleash human potential, right? Because humans want to do great stuff. Like, think about it. It was the same people in Iraq from August to September, except the leadership, right? It was the same troops doing the same stuff with the same goals, and they worked differently and got those radically different results. I thought that was pretty interesting. So John, who couldn't make it today, when he took over Explosive Ordnance Mobile Unit 2, he said he wanted to run an experiment because he wanted to run it differently. And so he says, in EOD, instead of making decisions, we run experiments. The experiments must be cost and risk must be low, temporary and reversible if there turns out to be a problem, and there's some metric to measure outcomes. And he said, implementing Scrum met all of those requirements. Because one of the things I want to tell you is it's not hard to do a few experiments and see if it works or not, right? It's not. Maybe it doesn't work. It doesn't work everywhere in every institution. It's not magic. So what he did is he did it in over the course of about 18 months. He said the immediate impact was to improve communications, prioritization, and task accomplishment, and the productivity of his teams increased over 1,200% over 18 months. That's more than twice the work in half the time. That's dramatic. And he's now training, I mean, he's doing a bunch of other stuff. He's in acquisitions now, but he's also training a bunch of Marines and sailors in Scrum, which is kind of cool. So he did want me to make one point really clear. I was talking to him, I went out to dinner with him like on Tuesday night. He said, make sure you say this. I was like, okay. He says, because people talk a lot about lean, and not lean startup, I mean just lean the process from the Lean Enterprise Institute versus Scrum. He says, lean, what lean does is this is the values from the Lean Enterprise Institute. You go on their website, this is what they say. And this all comes out of the Toyota production system invented by Taiichi Ohno in the 1950s. Again, it's really important to get where these ideas come from. So lean is identify the value, map the value stream, create flow through it, establish a pull system, so people are pulling the work rather than having it forced on them, and then you seek perfection. This is how almost all manufacturing on the planet is done these days. And it's called lean because this guy named Jack Womack, because in the late 80s, the US car industry was being destroyed by the Japanese car industry. And so the car manufacturers set up an institute at MIT, the Lean Enterprise Institute, and said, go figure out what's going on. And so they did. And they said, we need to do this. And if you've never seen like a lean manufacturing line, go Google one on YouTube, because they're like magic. It's like all of a sudden these robotic arms are sort of floating the parts through the air at just the right time. It's really cool. Scrum, and very interesting, because the lean people and the Scrum people were looking at the same teams at Toyota and came to slightly different conclusions. Scrum is about inspection and adaptation. Things change all the time. So you do an experiment, validate your hypothesis, and then adapt and do another one. It's about transparency, making the work visible, about speed, going fast. That is a huge value in Scrum. Speed of delivery of value. I heard someone say they've seen Scrum and Post-it notes being really abused. And the reason that happens is people interpret Scrum, doing Scrum to do Scrum instead of doing Scrum to produce value. When I talk to senior leadership, they do not want to do Scrum to do Scrum. They want to produce value as quickly as possible. If Scrum happens to be the best way to do that, they're totally in. But it's not to do Scrum. It's not to put a bunch of stickies on the wall. It's to get something done fast. And then you want to make sure it's the right things. You optimize what you're doing. Whether you're running an explosive ordnance disposal unit, whether you're making software, whether you're building agricultural equipment, whatever. You optimize what you're doing by getting constant feedback. And then you optimize how you're doing. How is the teams working together? How do we get this team to be a better team? Because we've all had those great teams, where everything just clicked. Think back, everyone had, hopefully, one of those experiences in their life when everything just worked magically. It was awesome. And what Scrum does is say, how do we attempt, and it's not necessarily going to work every time, how do we attempt to put ourselves in the way of being in the zone as a team? A buddy of mine's a novelist, he's a science fiction novelist. So I'm just going to plug his book, Old Man's War. That's a good science fiction book. But so people often ask him, they say, John, how do you come up with all your ideas? And he's really prolific. He writes a couple books a year. And having written a couple books, I did 5 years between books, okay? And he said, no, he says, here's what I do, JJ. At 8 a.m., I sit down at my desk and I start writing. And at noon, I stop. But some days the muse shows up and some days she doesn't. But if I wasn't there starting to write, she could never appear. Doesn't matter. Writing books and just about anything is ass and chair time. So, but what John wanted me to make the point is that lean makes you efficient. But in his experience, Scrum made them lethal. Because they learned. Now, the American military has done some amazing things. I just grabbed these pictures off the internet. I mean, from World War II to Gulf War I, Iraq, Afghanistan, Okinawa. It's really amazing. In wartime, people really innovate fast because your customer's giving you feedback. Right? But when you come back, it's peacetime, nothing happens. It's like, well, you go back to these bureaucratic rules. So why does the military act like it's wartime all the time? And I will tell you. And this is the same thing whether whatever you're doing. These are the rules of how people work together. The first one is that priority is a singular noun. How many people here have one top priority that they're working on? Couple. How about 2? 3? Or if you have more than 2 or 3, you do not have priorities. And know who picks the strategy for your organization? The most junior person, because they get to pick whatever they want to work at. And interesting, so I did a Google Ngram search where it searches all the books that have ever been published. The word priorities didn't become a word until the 1940s. Because priority is a Latin root word. It comes from a priori. It comes before. Having more than one is nonsensical. Also, you don't pluralize Latin root words by putting an S on the end. But people don't want to prioritize. It's crazy. Everyone knows they should. So I went to this one company, and they're a company, they do basic materials science, like original R&D and then commercialize them on a global scale. And they had 132 projects that they were working on. And of course, every person, every engineer in the place was working on like 5 of them at the same time. And they were getting nothing done. And they were mystified. Why couldn't they commercialize their research? And, well, how's that working for you? Working on 5 things at once and 130 projects. Horrible. And we all know that's horrible. We all know working on 5 things at once is stupid. We all know that, but we do it anyway. So we did with this company, we got them down to 10 projects. And I was like, it's not like you're going to not do those other 120 projects, but not right now. We're going to get these 10 done first. And all of a sudden they were releasing stuff faster and faster and faster. And they're making stuff like road paint, things like that. Reflective tape for signs, highway signs, things like that. So it really accelerated them. And also they got customers faster because they'd show stuff to say, I don't know, the Department of Transportation for California or something, and they'd say, we want to buy that. And they're like, well, it's not done. It's like, we don't care. We want to buy that today because they were getting feedback from their customers rapidly. But priorities are usually set because there's a bunch of people, senior people, who disagree about what they should be, and then they blame the teams when nothing gets done. And one of the things I would like you to walk away with is make that visible. Leaders should know the costs of the decisions they're making. That's really important. The other thing is delivering working product at the end of every sprint. So I see a lot of companies that talk about work, and organizations in the military, there's a lot of PowerPoint slides describing the work. There's not a lot of talk about there's not a lot of work and demonstrating what works. The only measure of progress in Agile or Scrum is stuff that works. I used to talk to, when I ran Morning Edition, one of NPR's morning show for a while, I asked these people, like, we worked so hard on this 3-minute radio piece. Do you care how many hours a producer worked on a radio piece you hear on NPR? Not at all. Your customers also don't care how hard you worked. The only thing that matters, tell them, I said, the only thing that matters is what comes out of the box. That's the only thing that matters. And if you're in technology, this is from a couple years ago. So I talked to the head of Amazon Web Services about 18 months ago when I got this data. About 80% of technology companies can't deliver more than once a month. About 2% can do it every day. Amazon has 3,000 Scrum teams, and they're delivering new functionality more than once a second. This is why everyone freaks out if Amazon is going to get into their space. I was in Germany. A colleague of mine was in Germany, and we were doing some Scrum classes. And these people from Deutsche Bank came up and said, hey, we need to go Scrum really fast. And I'm like, why? I mean, you're Deutsche Bank, right? You're gigantic. Oh, well, Amazon just started doing personal loans in Germany. They can approve people in 3 seconds. It takes us 3 weeks. We've lost that business forever. We are never going to get that business back. We're worried they do that to mortgages. Like, think about it. Do you care what bank your money is in? If Amazon took over the relationship and they're flipping between 10,000 banks every second based on which one gave you a better interest rate, and the bank is just the dumb regulated back end, that's what banks are scared about. That's what banks are afraid of, because it's happening. It's starting to happen. And the other thing is your structure. And by structure, I mean communication structure, not organizational structure. It's like McChrystal did, from command and control to command of teams to teams of teams. He didn't change the ranks, right? He changed how people talk to each other. And because your structure is your culture, your communication structure. It is. And that defines what your limits are. So, and that's what John figured out. He didn't change the rank structures inside of EOD or who was a staff sergeant or whatever. He just made them talk to each other differently. And the other few things, there's Conway's Law. Anyone familiar with Conway's Law? Yeah. It's organizations which design systems are constrained to produce designs which are copies of the communication structure of those organizations. So if you have a rigid and hierarchical communication structure, your product or your service or whatever you're making will be rigid, hierarchical, tightly coupled, hard to fix, hard to change. This is 30 or 40 years old. So this is just how humans work, right? This is not Scrum, this is just humans. Then, Brooks' Law, which goes back to 1973, by the way. Anyone read The Mythical Man-Month by Fred Brooks? It is a classic. And I've seen this proven a lot of times. So in this graph, on the this is like how long it takes to do the project. This is how much it costs, and this is how many people. So 2 people, this project, and there's a link here. I hope you guys can just PDF my slides and send them out to everybody. That's fine. And there's a link here if you want to go look at the research. This is not my research. And then if you get 4 people, it costs a little bit more, but takes a little bit shorter. 6 people, costs a little bit more, takes a little bit less time. You go to 10 people, it costs more, and it takes longer. Talking to a guy who works at IBM, and he's a buddy of mine up in Boston. And he said, yeah, they had a late project. He works in one of their big AI projects, and it was late, and the customers were yelling at them. And so the management just threw more people onto the teams. He's like, don't do that. And he said, JJ, I've reproved Brooks' Law. There's an inverse ratio between the number of Slack messages asking for help and the velocity of those teams. He's like, it's perfect. So, small teams are important. Anyone know what the perfect team size is? Harvard did a big meta-analysis of all the productivity research a couple years ago. 4.6. And by the way, I don't think Bezos knows anything about Agile at all. He was like, just small teams, fast delivery. And the guy, I was talking to the guy at AWS, says, the only way I could think to do that was with Scrum. I don't think Bezos cares. Does Bezos care about how people work? No. He cares about getting stuff out and being the most customer-centric company on the planet. Now, Amazon is not a perfect company by any means. They got a lot of problems, but they are fast. Third one is, and this is something that I know is happening in your dealings with the Defense Department, any foreign innovation in a corporation will stimulate the corporate immune system to create antibodies that destroy it. So when you're doing this kind of work, know what's going to happen and have a plan. What are you going to do? How do you make those people your allies instead of your enemies? Because that's going to happen. And I was rereading this book recently. This book was published in the early 90s by this Canadian philosopher, John Ralston Saul, called Voltaire's Bastards. I found this really interesting. I wanted to share it with you today. There's this sentence: the division of knowledge into feudal fiefdoms of expertise has made general understanding and coordinated action not simply impossible, but despised and distrusted. And I thought that was really interesting, because remember those team of teams that did such an amazing thing in Iraq? They don't exist anymore. As soon as the near failure, this is from Institute for National Strategic Studies, right? This is not me. As soon as the near failure in Iraq was averted, bureaucratic support for interagency teams began to decline. By 2008, other departments and agencies, particularly one unidentified intelligence agency, began pulling people back in cooperation, believing information sharing and collaboration had gone too far. The problem that happened there, McChrystal was an incredible leader. And a lot of his force of personality, because he was an incredible, he still is, he was an incredible person, he had incredible people around him. But when he was gone, there was no system to put it back and to keep it in place. And so I was talking to a couple of Navy SEALs the other night. I said, how many thousands of American soldiers are going to have to die as we relearn how to do this? Because we've forgotten on purpose. I'm dead serious. Talking to a Marine and said, well, why are you doing all this stuff for free for the military? And I said, because I saw a lot of people die in Iraq for no reason. And I would like that not to happen again, if I could do a tiny bit to help that not happen. Because there's no point. It's just tragic. So I'm going to leave you with a couple things, like what I want you to think about, what you can do tomorrow. Not Monday. I'll give you till Monday. First, don't confuse being busy with being done. I go to a lot of places where everyone's busy, like that R&D company I was telling you about. Everyone's working hard, but nothing is done. John Deere, we worked with them in one of their, they sort of had 8 R&D labs building new harvesters and combines and stuff across the world, like Moline, Brazil, India, a whole bunch of them. And they were working on a bunch of projects at once. And they got a really bad reputation inside of John Deere as the group that could not get anything done. And again, they just focused on one thing. And all of a sudden, they were able to get it done. This isn't rocket science. We know this. Because less is more here. Because it's not going to do everything, but it's so much faster if you do one thing at a time. Work on one project at a time. Because you want stable teams. I keep on expecting the slides to show up here. You want stable teams that don't change, because how long does it take a team to become high performing? 6 to 9 months. That's what the research shows. So if you have a project and then, okay, the project's ended, and you split up the team and put a bunch of new teams together, they're going to be slow for 6 to 9 months. And I see companies that run projects in a 6 to 9 month time frame and make sure their teams never get really good. And dedicated, by dedicated, I mean, and I actually have really good data on this. I don't have it in the slide deck, but I'm happy to provide it if anyone wants it. I have data on 75,000 teams. The teams that had everyone over 95% dedicated to one team were twice as fast as the teams that had people working for 2 teams. Twice as fast. And I have really good data on that. So do that. And if you can't do anything else, right, you're stuck in this bureaucratic organization. They're not interested in going agile. They just think it's a bunch of whatever. And I know that organizations like this exist. Just get your team together for 15 minutes every day. Just do a daily scrum, a daily stand-up, and say, hey, this is what I worked on yesterday, this is what I work on today, this is what's getting in my way, right? And take it on as your role to say, what's getting in the team's way? Why aren't they delivering quickly? And it's my job to see if I can get rid of it. How can I fix that? And take that on yourself, even if you have no power. Because what a Scrum Master's job is to make the impediments visible. Because if you don't make them visible, no one can fix them. And that happens a lot. Problems like to hide. One other thing John Hasse told me the other night, he said, listen, I used to have this thing like in the Navy, it was, don't bring me a problem unless you have a solution, right? And then he said, in the command at EOD, he said, and then I realized that made sure I wouldn't hear any of the really hard problems. They would hide them from me. And you had to plan for those. Because who gets interrupted during the week, right? Everybody. So plan for that. How are you going to deal with that? I know that IBM teams I was talking about, there were like 18 teams working on this project, and they, between 10 a.m. and noon, they turn off every single form of electronic communication, and they work together as a team just in the work. Then they turn back on at noon, and then they do it again from 1 to 3 in the afternoon. And they said, well, no extra meetings, no phone calls, no emails, no Slack, so they can focus. Can you find an hour in your day to turn everything off? Because context switching kills you. It's really bad. Small teams, as I said before, they're twice as fast. I have good data on that too. They really are. They're fast. Because what happens once you get above, this is how Brooks' Law works, once you get above 6 or 8 people, can you do a daily stand-up in 15 minutes? No. Everything just slows down. Like at Scrum Inc, and I do not have good data on this is just what I do. At 8 people, I cut teams in half. That's just the rule. And teams never want to do it because they're all, oh, my friends, but that's just the rule. And they're always faster. Always. Another thing is, in Scrum and Agile, you hear a lot about this term cross-functional. You want a cross-functional team. Well, all cross-functional means is this group of people collectively have all the skills needed to do this whatever work we're doing. They might be a bunch of specialists, right? But they're working together. And it's interesting, in the original paper that described Scrum, this idea of Scrum that my father used in 1994 was from 1986, called the New Product Development Game. It was in the Harvard Business Review. They used this word, instead of cross-functional, they said cross-pollinating. So the people on the team would teach other team members how they could help out with the stuff that they're working on. I know a team at Google, and there's a paper on this by Google. If you're interested, I can find it for you. So they decided, this team was in the AdWords group. These are the people, AdWords, they make all the money. And they decided, let's put together a software team standard. They had the tester, they had the UI person, they had a designer, they had a developer, all the sort of standards, software specialties. And they said, we're going to get cross-functional. Totally full stack. Every single one of us. So what they did is, next thing that was on the Scrum board to do, that whoever was available picked it up, whether they knew how to do it or not. And then they learned how to do it that day, usually by pairing with a person who was the expert. So they were kind of slow for 6 months. Then they got really, really fast. Now when I talk to software developers, I'm like, how much is a full stack software developer worth? A lot. They can name their own price in a lot of places. And in the technology business, you just walk out the door and get more money. So how happy do you want your people on your teams to be, your technical people? They have options, really good ones. I was looking at that current state. People are like, yeah, the Uber for cats pays more than the government. So people don't go into government just to go into government. They go into government with a sense of service and obligation, and and there's pride in that. But if you crush them, they'll leave. The other thing I'll leave with this is a quote from my book: make a decision. Don't wait. Those who dawdle are overtaken by events, and those who act seize the opportunities created by them. Don't wait. Do. I've seen people say, this is how we're going to be agile. We're going to spend 6 months studying it, roll it out in this tiny little piece, and then we'll spend another year evaluating it. And the only way to learn how to do this kind of stuff is to do it, to actually do it, and run experiments, like John Boyd's OODA loop. You have a hypothesis that we might work better if we did it this way. Okay, prove it. Just try it. So, I would encourage you to do something Monday. I mean, why not? What have you got to lose? Happy to take any questions. Anyone? Bueller?
You mentioned, let's see, I'm trying to read my notes, sorry. Where is it? Oh, the only measures of progress are delivered and how quickly, right? What about sustainability? Because
if I elided over that, I apologize. But you want to be able them to deliver and how quickly? Forever. So
Okay.
they need to work at a sustainable pace. There's some
Right.
really interesting research that came out of Israel, and they were studying Israeli parole judges, like deciding how criminals are going to get introduced back into society. And they studied, and they found out at the beginning of the day, the judges were really creative. And then as the day wore on, they got more and more rigid and just following the rule book. And it turns out, the researchers found, there's a chemical in your brain called glucosamine that every time you make a decision, you burn up a little bit of it. And it needs to eat, you need to rest, you need to do all the other stuff to build up more. Right? Everyone's had those days where you make so many decisions, you walk out, and you're like, I can't even decide what to have, I can't make another decision. There's no way. That's what happened to you. And so this research, when I shared this research, this guy named Scott Maxwell, he's a founder and managing partner of this VC firm up in Boston. Now, VC guys, these are the money guys, right? And he found this and he said, okay, basically, if people get tired, they make mistakes, and it takes longer the next day to fix the mistakes that they introduced the night before. So it opened to him, these are the VC guys. If you don't leave your desk at 5 o'clock, that's a problem. If you go on vacation and someone has to reach you for some knowledge that should have been shared, your first meeting when you get back is with Scott Maxwell. Why did you put my company at risk? So they're really brutal about it. So I did a lot over that. You're right. Sustainable pace is very important.
You were really speaking to my inner geek with the data and the background, kind of research that drives what you do. But I'm wondering if you've ever had a team or an organization that tried Scrum and then left it, and if they gave you any feedback that came from maybe a more emotional place or an intuitive place rather than a data-driven decision. And can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure. Scrum fails a bunch of different ways. As I said, it's not magic. One is overburden. People just like not having a sustainable pace, just like forcing too much stuff onto the teams and not having a pull system from that happens a lot. When teams feel neglected, because often people say, oh, and I'm going to use some Scrum terms here if you don't know what they mean, and product owners, which are just the people who prioritize stuff, when they say, okay, you busy executive, I know you're busy, but the other 20% of your time you're going to be this product owner for this team deciding what they should be building. I don't have time. They don't have time to do it. They're not committed to it. And Scrum really lives or dies by product owners. And that's like the design thinking stuff and the lean startup stuff is really good at figuring out what you should be doing. And that's the product owner role in Scrum. The Scrum is all about execution. Where else does it fail? Anyone here heard of cargo cults? Oh, this is a great story, and I swear I am not making this up. So World War II, the Navy was going around island hopping in the South Pacific to get to the Japanese, and they showed up in Vanuatu, and they built a huge base on one of the islands in that nation, and eventually a couple 100,000 Americans were there. And the people who lived there were just like, what is going on? All of this cargo is coming in, food, medical supplies, and then of course the soldiers and sailors would give it out to locals, right? And then of course the war ends and they all go away. It vanishes almost overnight. And so this, in the native religion, they sort of morphed their Messiah figure, and they changed it, and the name of the Messiah figure was John from America. But John from, I swear I'm not making this up. And then they said, well, why did the cargo stop? Why did John from, our Messiah, not give us more cargo? I said, well, because we're not perfect enough, right? Classic, this is classic stuff in a religion. And so they said, what was here when the cargo was coming? It's like, there were airfields. So they started building, fake airfields in the middle of the jungle. Radar out of wood, with torches as the running lights. I'm totally serious. And so that's what happens with Scrum. People say, I'm really excited. I went to this training, and I got a lot of Post-it notes, and it's awesome. And they do all these events, and they do all this stuff, but nothing happens. They started. You don't do Scrum to do Scrum. You do Scrum to do stuff. And do it fast and well. Yeah. I think I want you to wait for the microphone just because I think there are people online. All right, who took the mic? Okay.
So question for you concerns the intersection. Radio check, anything? Question concerns the intersection of Scrum and planning. So it makes a ton of sense from a product development perspective. You work a lot with small teams and operations. One challenge I would run into when it comes to organizational planning, especially the way the military talks about strategy, is like this design for like a 5-year, 10-year, long-term plan that inherently struggles to exist in an environment where stuff changes so rapidly that current state assumptions rarely exist 10 years from now. How do you leverage these methodologies for that end state?
Sure. No, that's hard stuff, right? That's really hard stuff. First of all, don't believe your 10-year plan at all, because it's not going to happen. And so usually when I work with leaders is I say, we want your vision of the future state. Where do you want to be? What do you want your organization to be capable of doing? You know, what's your vision, then what's your strategy? Okay, and how are we going to measure how much progress we're making towards that next week? Because you have to have the long-term stuff, but then you say, how are we going to measure, what are we going to do next week to make that long-term stuff happen, and how are we going to measure progress towards it? And so Scrum, you know, sort of, you have planning sessions, and I mean, listen, you know, some of my clients are building, you know, rockets and airplanes, and it takes a long time, right? But you say, okay, I want this rocket to have this capability. Well, next week we need to get our engine up on the test bed and do a propulsion test, a pressure test, because that helps us get there. But you want all the short-term stuff feeding towards that long-term goal. And that's like, what's the next most responsible step? And then you get the validated feedback and you realize, oh, that long-term goal shifted. Scrum teams, who cares? Does it help?
It does. Just to repeat.
Yeah. Only let them plan the next 2 or 3 weeks, though. Because then they'll be, oh, let's plan all 5 years. It's like, no, okay, this is where we want to go. This is what we're going to do in the next month to try to get closer. And we're going to inspect, are we getting closer every week? Like, why not? Yeah, you had a question. Oh, sure. You're getting looked over, I apologize. Yeah.
Afternoon, JJ. How are you?
I'm well.
Thanks. Hey, so my question was in terms of Lean Six Sigma as it applies to manufacturing. I'm familiar how the Scrum method works for it's used in tech, but how do you apply the Scrum methods to manufacturing for optimal?
Yeah, so, I mean, Lean is really good in manufacturing. I would not say don't use it, because you want to be efficient. But what happens in manufacturing is it's sort of, you need to be able to shift from one state to another. When everything is working perfectly, you just want to lean, get that flow, seek perfection. That's the only thing you do. But stuff doesn't work perfectly all the time. And so you want to be able to get those same group of people to immediately form agile teams to address a problem. So like at Toyota, and this is, because a lot of the lean stuff, I would encourage you to look back at the Toyota production system, because a lot of the interpretation of that by Americans and Europeans is not like they're going through the motions somewhat. But so in Toyota, one of the things, if there's a problem on the line, every employee is encouraged to pull what's called the and-on cord, which stops the line, the whole line. And everyone comes together, including managers, to say, how do we make sure this problem never happens again? Let's get to the root cause. And it will stop the line. So that's sort of like an agile team forming to fix a problem that's out of the scope of an efficient production line. Does that help?
Yes, it does.
Sure. Finally.
Hopefully. There it is. Hey. I just had a clarification of the question that the other woman in red asked. And your answer had to do with a study of Israeli probation judges. Mm-hmm. And the clarification is, was there an optimal number or duration for that type of intense decision-making that was the result of that study? And what was that study called?
I don't remember the name. Does anyone have a copy of the Red Book? Scrum, the Art of Doing Twice the Work in Half the Time. If you pick it up, it's in the index, and I cite the study. I really do believe in citing research. So you look, feel free to look there, because I don't know it off the top of my head. And usually about 6 hours. Yeah. I mean, yeah, but it really does depend on the individual, of course. You know, what kind of shape are they in? How do they eat? How do they sleep? You know, so there's biological variation between people. About 6 hours.
All right, we got one final question.
So I'm fascinated by your comment about the relationship between culture and structure. And I think that we as a forum do a pretty good job of influencing cultural change, maybe even procedural change, but we don't have any conversations about structural change. This morning, one of the panels, there was a question about the longevity of these innovation organizations being 4 years, I think, roughly. Is that a feature or a bug? I'm interested in any advice you might have for us as to how we might go about inspiring some structural change across the DoD that will make sure that the longevity of some of the initiatives that we're trying to inspire is longer than that 4 years.
And also you move people around every 2 years and all this other kind of stuff, which makes it tricky. But you can, what I would do is you find there's a lot of pockets of Scrum in the military, and I'm not even, I mean, in the defense acquisition business, I know I'm like the big defense contractors, I know there is. You can, I mean, you guys have clearance that I don't. Go ask. But you know, talk to Mike. There he is. You know, he has a lot of stuff. And John Hasse, I mean, he shares this kind of stuff all the time. But the real thing is, it's not because sometimes you've tried to change the org chart. Like I would love it if everyone changed their org charts, but that's really hard. But if you can say, well, those are our job titles, but when we're working this way, we're only going to use the Scrum roles. And we're not going to change it. But what you do really want to think about is what you reward. Because people aren't stupid. If you reward one set of behavior, but you say you want another set of behavior, they will do the first one. And you say, oh, and this is what happens all the time. Oh, we're going to change, we're going to be agile, it's going to be all this kind of stuff, but you know, the bonus system is completely the same. The promotion system is completely the same. What you're rated on is completely the same. You know, if I was a real up-and-comer smart person, I'd be like, yeah, this is total bullshit over here. I'm like, why would I even talk to these people? I bet you're running into that. I don't know how hard that is to change. It can be really hard in corporate America, and I can imagine it's even more difficult in government. But you know, I was talking to John about it. He said, well, how would I get these people? I was like, well, John, you're a commander, right? You write recommendations for people to get promoted. Like to say, I'll write you that recommendation if you do stuff this way. So, and he just did it. I mean, so he didn't have to change anything. He didn't have to change any Navy rules. He just worked within the system to find out how does he reward the right behavior. Well, thank you very much.
Help me thank JJ very much.